The cracks in Washington's imperial facade are showing, and Venezuela has become the fracture line nobody in power wanted you to see. For decades, the playbook was simple. Sanctions, regime change operations, demonization in the media, and eventually a compliant government that opens its resources to American corporations. But something fundamental has shifted. Venezuela isn't collapsing on command. Despite the longest and most brutal economic siege in modern history, sanctions that have devastated its economy more severely than strategic bombing campaigns, the nation remains standing, defiant, and increasingly connected to a new axis of global power that doesn't answer to Washington. This isn't just about one country's resistance. It's about the unraveling of a 70-year system where American diktat determined which governments lived and which died. What we're witnessing is the birth pangs of a multipolar world where military might and financial coercion no longer guarantee obedience, where countries are finding alternative pathways through Chinese investment, Russian cooperation, and regional solidarity. The panic in Washington isn't hysteria, it's the cold realization that the empire's most reliable tools are breaking in its hands, and Venezuela's survival is the proof that terrifies them most. Let me step back for a moment and tell you what nobody in Washington wants to acknowledge. Venezuela was never supposed to survive this long. The architects of American foreign policy, the strategists who sit in think tanks funded by defense contractors and energy conglomerates, they had drawn up the timeline years ago. Maximum pressure, they called it. Starve the economy, freeze the assets, cut off the banking system, prohibit the sale of oil, make it impossible for medicines to reach hospitals, for food to reach markets, for spare parts to reach factories. The calculation was cold and precise. 6 months, maybe a year at most, and Maduro would be gone. The government would crumble, the military would fracture, and whoever Washington anointed as the legitimate leader would walk into Miraflores Palace with the keys to the country's oil reserves. That was the plan. That was always the plan. But here we are years later, and Venezuela is still there, battered, wounded, struggling under the weight of economic warfare that would have toppled almost any other nation on earth, but still standing, still sovereign, still refusing to hand over the keys to its future. Now, I want you to understand something crucial about how empires operate, because this isn't really about Venezuela at all. It's about the precedent. It's about what happens when a small country, a relatively weak country, by conventional military measures, looks at the most powerful empire in human history and says, no, because that word, that simple word, is the one thing empires cannot tolerate. Rome couldn't tolerate it. The British Empire couldn't tolerate it. And the American empire certainly cannot tolerate it. When you control the global financial system, when your currency is the reserve currency of the world, when your military has 800 bases spread across every continent, when your intelligence agencies have overthrown more governments than most people can count, the idea that a country like Venezuela could simply refuse your demands is an existential threat to the entire architecture of power. It's not about the oil, though the oil matters. It's not even about the ideology, though they'll tell you it's about democracy and human rights. It's about obedience. It's about maintaining the system where Washington decides which governments are legitimate and which aren't, where American economic interests take precedence over national sovereignty, where the rules-based international order means rules that America writes and everyone else follows. Venezuela understood this from the beginning. Hugo Chavez understood it. Whatever you think about Chavez, whatever criticisms you might have of his governance, his economic policies, his authoritarian tendencies, he understood the fundamental nature of the relationship between the United States and Latin America. He had studied the history. He knew about Guatemala in 1954 when the CIA overthrew a democratically elected government because it dared to implement land reform that affected United Fruit Company. He knew about Chile in 1973 when Allende was murdered and Pinochet installed because Chilean socialism threatened American corporate interests. He knew about Nicaragua, about El Salvador, about the School of the Americas where the United States trained the death squads that terrorized Central America for generations. He knew about the Monroe Doctrine, that 19th century declaration that Latin America was America's backyard, its sphere of influence, its property to manage as it saw fit. And he decided that Venezuela would chart a different course. He used the country's oil wealth not to enrich foreign corporations and a tiny domestic elite, but to fund social programs, literacy campaigns, healthcare initiatives, housing projects. Were they perfect? Were they sustainable? That's debatable, but they were Venezuela's choices made by Venezuelans for Venezuelans, and that was unforgivable. The American response was predictable because it's always predictable. First came the diplomatic pressure, the stern warnings, the lectures about democracy from a country that has interfered in more elections than any other in history. Then came the economic pressure, the targeted sanctions, the financial restrictions, the quiet conversations with banks and corporations about the risks of doing business with Venezuela. Then came the demonization, the media campaign that portrayed every Venezuelan government action in the worst possible light, that amplified every opposition voice while ignoring the millions who supported the government. That reduced a complex political situation into a simple narrative of dictatorship versus democracy. And finally came the sanctions, the real sanctions. The comprehensive economic warfare designed not to pressure the government into changing specific policies, but to destroy the economy entirely, to create such misery and suffering that the population would have no choice but to overthrow their government. This is what they call humanitarian intervention. Now they destroy your economy, watch your children starve, block the medicine that could save lives, and then blame your government for the crisis they created. But something went wrong with the plan. The Venezuelan government didn't collapse. The military didn't defect. The popular uprising that was supposed to sweep through the streets of Caracas never materialized in the way Washington expected. And most importantly, Venezuela found alternatives. This is the part that truly terrifies the empire, because the entire sanctions regime is built on the premise that there is no alternative to the American-dominated global financial system. If you're cut off from SWIFT, if you can't access dollars, if American banks won't touch your transactions, you're supposed to be finished. That's the leverage. That's the power. But Venezuela started trading oil with China in yuan. It deepened its relationship with Russia, receiving investment, technical support, and military cooperation. It found sympathetic partners in Turkey, in Iran, in India, countries that were willing to work around the sanctions to find creative solutions to keep the Venezuelan economy functioning, even under siege. And this is where the panic really sets in. Because if Venezuela can survive maximum pressure, if it can find pathways around American economic coercion, then what does that mean for the entire system of hegemony? Let me tell you what's happening in Washington right now in the corridors of power where these decisions are made. There's a recognition, quiet but growing, that the toolkit isn't working anymore. The sanctions that were supposed to be surgical have become blunt instruments that hurt ordinary people while leaving governments intact. The regime change operations that used to be almost routine have become embarrassing failures, from the absurd coup attempt with the former Green Berets who got captured almost immediately to the failed recognition of Juan Guaido as president. A move so divorced from reality that even America's closest allies eventually abandoned it. These people sat in meetings and declared Guaido the legitimate president of Venezuela, and they expected the world to simply accept this fiction because America said so. For a while, some countries played along, but you can't will reality into existence through press releases. Guaido had no control over the government, no control over the military, no control over the territory, no ability to govern. He was a president in name only, a president of American imagination. And eventually the whole charade collapsed under the weight of its own absurdity. What Venezuela represents is something larger than itself. And this is what I need you to understand. Every country in the global south is watching this. They're watching to see if it's possible to resist American pressure and survive. They're watching to see if there are alternatives to the Washington consensus, to the neoliberal economic policies that promised prosperity and delivered inequality, debt and dependency. They're watching to see if sovereignty still means anything in a world where one country claims the right to sanction anyone, anywhere, for any reason. And increasingly, they're reaching the conclusion that the American order is not the only option, that there are other models, other partnerships, other possibilities. China has become the largest trading partner for more countries than the United States. The Belt and Road Initiative, whatever its flaws and whatever debt traps it might create, represents an alternative source of infrastructure investment that doesn't come with lectures about human rights or demands for neoliberal reform. Russia has positioned itself as a partner for countries that want to pursue independent foreign policies without American interference. Regional organizations like ALBA and CLC have created spaces for Latin American cooperation that exclude the United States entirely. This is the nightmare scenario for American policymakers. Not that Venezuela might fall into chaos, but that it might succeed in charting an independent path, because success is contagious. Success undermines the narrative that there is no alternative. Success encourages other countries to think that maybe they too can resist, that maybe they too can say no to demands that violate their sovereignty, that maybe they too can pursue economic models that prioritize their own development over the profits of foreign corporations. The entire architecture of American power in Latin America has been built on the assumption that resistance is feudal, that the United States has too much power, too much money, too much military might, too much control over the global economy for any small country to successfully defy it. But Venezuela has been defying it for years now. And while the cost has been enormous, while the suffering has been real, the government has not fallen. That's a fact that cannot be explained away. That's a reality that undermines the entire theory of hegemonic power. Now let's talk about what this means for the broader global order. Because Venezuela is not happening in isolation. It's happening at the same time that Russia has resisted years of sanctions and continues to function as a major power. It's happening while China has built an economic system that rivals America's in size and increasingly in technological sophistication. It's happening while the BRICS nations are discussing alternatives to the dollar, creating new payment systems, new development banks, new mechanisms for trade that don't require American intermediation. It's happening while countries across Africa and Asia are refusing to pick sides in the new Cold War that Washington is trying to construct. The world is fragmenting, and American power, while still immense, is not what it was 20 or 30 years ago. The unipolar moment that Francis Fukuyama celebrated as the end of history lasted barely a decade before it began to crack, and Venezuela impossibly has become one of those cracks. I think about the sheer arrogance it took to believe that the United States could simply starve Venezuela into submission. The sanctions have been devastating. We're talking about tens of billions of dollars in lost oil revenue. We're talking about a contraction of the economy that rivals the Great Depression. We're talking about hyperinflation, about shortages of basic goods, about a healthcare system that collapsed under the weight of being unable to import medicine and equipment. Millions of Venezuelans have fled the country, creating a refugee crisis that has spread across Latin America. The human cost has been staggering, and all of this was deliberate. These were not unintended consequences. These were the intended unintended consequences. The architects of the sanctions knew exactly what would happen. They knew people would suffer. They knew children would go hungry. They knew hospitals would run out of insulin and antibiotics, and they did it anyway, because the calculation was that the suffering would be worth it if it led to regime change. This is what humanitarian intervention looks like in practice. This is what democracy promotion means in the real world. It means deliberately destroying an economy, and then blaming the government you're trying to overthrow for the destruction you caused. But here's what they didn't count on. They didn't count on the resilience of the Venezuelan people. The ones who didn't flee, the ones who stayed and found ways to survive, who built local supply networks, who started urban gardens, who learned to live with constant shortages and still maintain some form of social cohesion. They didn't count on the government's ability to adapt, to find new trading partners, to develop cryptocurrency systems, to evade financial sanctions, to maintain enough functionality in the oil sector to keep some revenue flowing. They didn't count on the support from other countries that were willing to defy American pressure. And they didn't count on the changing global context where American threats The panic in Washington is real because the implications are profound. If the sanctions regime doesn't work on Venezuela, where does it work? If maximum pressure can be endured, what leverage does America really have over countries that are determined to maintain their independence? The military option has always been there theoretically, but invading Venezuela would be a disaster of epic proportions. It's not Iraq or Libya. It's a country with real military capabilities, mountainous terrain, a population that includes millions who would resist occupation and allies who would provide support. And it's in Latin America where memories of American intervention are still fresh, where the political costs of another invasion would be enormous. So the military option remains what it's always been, more a threat than a realistic policy, which leaves economic coercion as the primary tool. And if economic coercion doesn't work, if countries can survive it and find alternatives, then what's left? What power does the empire really have? This is why Venezuela matters so much more than its size or its GDP would suggest. It's a test case, it's a laboratory for resistance. Every country that has ever been threatened with sanctions, every government that has ever been told to comply or face economic warfare, is watching to see if Venezuela can make it through to the other side. And increasingly, it looks like it might. The economy has stabilized somewhat, the hyperinflation has slowed, oil production, while still far below its peak, has started to recover. New relationships have been built that bypass American control. The government has weathered the worst of the storm and is still standing. This doesn't mean Venezuela is thriving. It doesn't mean the crisis is over, but it means survival is possible. It means resistance can endure. And that lesson will resonate far beyond Venezuela's borders. I want you to think about what the world looks like if the American model of hegemony continues to break down. We're already seeing the signs. The war in Ukraine has not produced the isolation of Russia that Washington expected. The sanctions on Russia have not collapsed the Russian economy. Instead, they've accelerated the creation of alternative economic systems, pushed Russia and China closer together, and demonstrated to the entire world that even a direct confrontation with American power doesn't necessarily end in defeat. The attempt to contain China has failed spectacularly. China is now more central to the global economy than ever, more technologically advanced, more confident in its own model of development. The Middle East is increasingly charting its own course, with Saudi Arabia normalizing relations with Iran, with regional powers making decisions based on their own interests rather than American preferences. Africa is asserting itself more forcefully, demanding better terms from both Western countries and China, refusing to be treated as a passive arena for great power competition. All of this is connected to what's happening in Venezuela, because every successful act of resistance weakens the system of control a little bit more. Every country that survives American pressure makes it easier for the next country to try. Every alternative economic arrangement that gets created makes the dollar-based system a little less essential. Every regional organization that excludes the United States makes American influence a little less automatic. This is not a sudden collapse. This is not the dramatic end of empire that happens in a single moment. This is the slow grinding erosion of hegemonic power, the accumulation of small defeats and failed policies and diminishing returns on coercion. And Venezuela, against all odds, has contributed to that erosion. The tragedy in all of this is the human cost. The Venezuelan people have paid an enormous price for their government's resistance and for Washington's economic warfare. The suffering has been real and widespread. Families have been torn apart, lives have been lost, futures have been derailed, and for what? So that Washington could try to maintain its control over Latin America, so that American corporations could access Venezuelan oil on favorable terms, so that the principle of hegemony could be upheld. The cruelty of it is staggering when you step back and look at it clearly. An entire nation has been subjected to economic siege because its government refused to subordinate itself to American interests, and through it all, Washington has claimed the moral high ground, has insisted that it's acting in the name of democracy and human rights, has portrayed itself as the defender of the Venezuelan people against their own government. The sheer hypocrisy would be laughable if it weren't so deadly serious. But here's what gives me some hope in all of this darkness. The fact that Venezuela has survived means that other forms of global order are possible. It means that national sovereignty doesn't have to be a fiction. It means that economic development doesn't have to follow the neoliberal model. It means that countries can make different choices and live with the consequences without being destroyed by external pressure. This doesn't mean I endorse everything the Venezuelan government has done. It doesn't mean I think their economic policies have been wise or their governance has been democratic. But it means I believe in the principle that Venezuelans should decide Venezuela's future, not bureaucrats in Washington. It means I believe that economic sanctions that deliberately cause mass suffering are immoral regardless of their stated objectives. It means I believe the world will be better off when no single country can claim the right to strangle another country's economy because it disapproves of that country's government. We are living through the end of the American century. That's not a prediction, that's an observation. The question is not whether American hegemony will continue in its post-World War II form. It won't. The question is what comes next. Will it be a multipolar world where different centers of power balance each other and smaller countries have more room to maneuver? Will it be a bipolar world split between American and Chinese spheres of influence? Will it be a chaotic fragmentation with regional conflicts and economic disruption? The answer will depend partly on how Washington responds to its declining dominance. If it accepts the reality of a changing world and works to build cooperative frameworks that respect sovereignty and mutual benefit, we might transition relatively peacefully into a more balanced global order. If it doubles down on coercion, if it tries to maintain hegemony through ever more aggressive economic and military pressure, we're headed for conflict and chaos. Venezuela is a microcosm of this larger choice. Washington can continue to try to crush Venezuela through sanctions and sabotage, or it can accept that Venezuela has the right to chart its own course and work toward a relationship based on mutual respect rather than domination. The fact that Washington continues to choose punishment over engagement tells you everything you need to know about how it will handle the broader decline of its global power. And that should worry all of us, because a declining hegemon that refuses to accept its decline is one of the most dangerous forces in international politics. It will take risks it shouldn't take. It will escalate conflicts it should diffuse. It will destroy things it can't control, and the rest of the world will pay the price for America's inability to gracefully accept that it is no longer the sole superpower dictating terms to everyone else. Venezuela has shown that resistance is possible. Now, we need to see if wisdom is possible in Washington. Based on the evidence so far, I'm not optimistic. But the fact that Venezuela is still standing, still sovereign, still refusing to surrender, gives me some reason to believe that a different world is within reach.